It's very important that when you're going to purchase one of these things, you got to figure out, especially your first rod, is to figure out what kind of fishing you're going to do, where you're going to fish, because you're going to gear your jigs towards that kind of fishing, and you want to gear your rod towards that type of fishing. You should always pick the rod based on the jig weight and not the fish. So don't worry about hooking a big fish on these light rods. It really has to do with the weight of the jig. The weight's not right on your rod, on the jigs. What's going to happen is you're going to wind up fighting the rod to make the jig work, and you don't want to do that. Most rods have a jig range rating. You want to kind of start fishing from the middle of the jig rating towards the higher end of the jig ratings. Most of these jig rods will always tend to fish they'll rate the rods a little bit lighter than the jigs they would want to fish, even though say 100 grams to 300 grams. That rod's not going to fish 100 grams at all. It's going to fish 180 grams, 200 grams to 300 grams, maybe even 320 grams. It's never going to fish the lower end of the jig rating. So don't look at a rod goes, oh, it's a 20 to 100 gram jig rod. I can fish 20 grams to 100 grams. It's not going to work. It's going to fish 60, 80, 100 grams, maybe 120 grams. But it's not going to fish the 20 or 30 gram stuff.
So Ceasar, would you say that when, for a newcomer that walks into Sav-On Tackle and as Anthony is looking for a slow pitch jigging rod, first thing that maybe the person should have in their mind is know what kind of fish they want to catch?
Absolutely. How deep they're going to target, how deep they're going to fish,
Kind of the trip they're going to do.
Kind of trip they're going to do, what they're going to start targeting first.
Half day, 3/4 day.
So basically, if I walked into the store and said, hey Anthony, I want to buy my first slow pitch jigging rod, and I just said it like that, Anthony's first question to me would be, well, what do you want to fish? What do you want to target? Yeah. So I would have to answer, I'd be like, well, I don't know. I want to catch yellowtail, or I want to catch rockfish. So, and then based on that, you identify.
We'll play 100 questions and kind of narrow it down a little bit. So don't take the questions as we're dismissive. We are really just trying to narrow down to get you the ideal setup. If you leave it where you just have no idea and you're like, I just want the setup, we're going to get you something that's going to cover a lot, but it's going to be in the middle of the range. We'll try to get you something that'll fish anywhere from 4 to 6 ounces or 4 to 8 ounces very comfortably, and that's what we'll set you up with. But if you have an idea like, hey, I typically do my half day, I do a lot of twilight fishing, stuff like that, then we're going to know, hey, most of those boats are fishing anywhere from 60 feet to 150 feet as standard for their sand bass, calicos, sculpin, and we're going to set you up with something very appropriate for that. But if you want to go fish deeper for yellowtail and you tend to do the longer trips or the day and a half overnight where you might be fishing up to 300 feet, then we're going to set you up with something that'll accommodate a jig that'll get you into that zone.
If you were to get a rod that was rated to fish 150 to 300 grams, that'd be a rod you can pretty much use for everything from rockfish to tuna fishing. The only difference is you would switch from a small reel when you're fishing coastal inshore to a large reel fishing offshore where you need capacity, and it all will fit on the same rod. It will actually all work on the same rod. So don't be worried about buying a reel that's going to be too big or too small, because depending on what you're going to use it for, they will all be used on the same rod. And then what it comes down to, it's all about line capacity. When you're fishing inshore, you can use smaller diameter braid. Most of the small reels will hold plenty of line. If you're fishing offshore for tuna, you definitely want to have a little more line capacity, just because you're going to be fishing a lot deeper to start with to get bit, and the fish are tendency to run a little bit more.
And I was just pulling up the one of the cool features with the Pin Fathoms is they actually advertise their line capacity on the back crossbar. So I was looking at the line capacity real quick. A 40-pound braid is very appropriate to cover a wide range of fish. Your yellowtail, small grade tuna, rockfish. Their 15 extra narrow is advertising 430 yards of 40-pound standard braid. If you could find an even thinner braid like a Max Quattro or something else that's really thin, you could definitely get even more than that on there, allowing you to target some larger tuna with that really, you see how small that reel is in my hand. Just because of the line capacity on this reel, you could target some better grade fish.
Plus it's a 2-speed.
Plus it's a 2-speed. That's going to be one of the things, thank you Ceasar, that eliminates a lot of that pressure when you're fighting these bigger fish.
Yes.
Longer battles, you're not going to be able to utilize a rail. So having that easy button really makes a difference in getting those fish in. And again, going back to the stamina thing, being excited to drop back down and do it again.
Yeah, one of the questions that keeps coming up is gear ratio on reels. You don't want to fish a super high gear ratio, 8-to-1. You don't want to fish a real low gear ratio, 4-to-1. You want to fish something in between, like a 5.6, 5.8, 6.3, up to 7-1. Anywhere in that range, you can pretty much target anything you want to catch. Just remember that when you're fishing these rods, that it's not like a traditional rod where you want to lift way up high and wind down. You want to lock your arm in a 45, hold it in place, and just let your reel do the work. If that rod's bending and it wants to touch the water tip, let the tip touch the water. Just keep winding. When you can gain line, you gain line. Pretty soon that fish comes right up. It's very, very forgiving way to fish.
And call for a gaff with most of these rods. You don't want
to bounce them.
Yeah, you're going to be high sticking in order to bounce a fish over. So either grab the line for your rockfish, take a half wrap, and manually lift them over, or ask for a gaff to get those fish over. Even on the rockfish, I always bring them up to the water. I'll grab the line and pull it up manually. That way, you're not high sticking the rods.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to fish heavy leaders on your rods. I mean, you look at the line rating, and it's fine. It's basically meant for your main line. Your leaders, it's just there. You fish heavier leaders for abrasion resistance and everything else. Typically, I run 20 to 30 pound braid on my slow pitch reels for inshore and a little bit offshore, and I'll run like 40 to 60 pound leader. So when I can get it up, I can grab that line and just flip the fish in without having to call for a gaff or anything else like that.
Man, incredible knowledge in terms of choosing your rod and reel and your jigs. If you have any questions more on that, again, just go to your local shop and lean on their expertise to help you find the best combo for you based on what you want to do. For our next section, Ceasar, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and then if we can bounce back to Anthony, I know that this is possibly an endless question to answer and an impossible one to cover in one segment, but if we can just kind of scratch the surface of techniques, and if you can talk about how to slow pitch jig and what's the idea of it and what are you trying to accomplish when you're slow pitch jigging.
Okay, so there's basically two techniques to slow pitch fishing. One is what we call hybrid jigging, where you're pumping it, winding it, pumping it, winding it, pumping it, winding it 4 to 5 times. Don't get bit, pop it in free spool, drop it back down to the bottom. We call that bottom knocking. So you're contacting the bottom all the time. And on that setup, you really want to run your hooks on top of the jig so you don't get stuck on the bottom. The next technique is where you're fishing the mid columns. When you're fishing mid columns, you want to look for jigs that are a little bit more flat profile, not so much cylinder or butt weighted profiles, because you want to pull up, when you hit bottom, you want to wind up to the zone, 20, 30 turns off the bottom, and then you're going to do the same motion 5, 6 times up, free spool it, and you don't want to drop it all the way back to the bottom. You want to drop it back down to where you started from, and you're fishing the mid-column fish. Generally, you want a jig that's a little bit flatter profile, so it has a lot more flutter on the way down. Not so much rocking motion. You actually want to see it shimmy like this, more of a shimmy down. And what you want to do is when you lift up, you'll pump, and you do what we call a long sweep. You'll sweep up, and you'll slack off real quick. As soon as you slack off, you'll see your line will have a big belly and pulling up on the surface. And then what you do is you'll watch that jig fall, and your line will start going down, going down, going down, and all of a sudden it'll stop like you hit bottom. Well, you're 50 feet off the bottom, you're not hitting bottom. So that's usually a bite, and just wind down into the fish. I see a lot of guys, when that line slacks off, they all want to set the hook, and you really don't. You just want to wind into it. Just wind down till your rod tip comes tight, rod tip loads up, and then all of a sudden you feel the fish pulling on it. You don't really want to swing on these things. And that's probably the two most popular techniques for fishing this stuff. Now, if you're fishing yellowtail or fast-moving fish, you can use a skinnier jig, a skinnier profile jig, and you really want to work it a lot quicker. It's a faster cadence, and you're not really dropping it back down. You want to drop it to the bottom and just quick whip, wind, whip and wind, whip and wind, whip and wind, whip and wind. And in between, you can do a long sweep and then continue whip and wind, whip and wind. And a lot of times on the long sweeps when you get bit. 3 to 4 pumps, do a long sweep for yellowtail, and even for tuna, really gets bit really well.
Would it be correct to say that that's kind of the reason for the light braid? I think Anthony probably already said this, but that's the reason for the light braid is to be able to get down to the bottom without scoping out. Okay.
Yeah, less water resistance.
Yeah. You got current down there. You might not see a lot of current on the surface, but down 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet, there's going to be different currents going different directions. The thicker your braid, the coarser the weave of the braid, you'll find you'll have a lot bigger belly, and it's also going to affect the way your lure falls. Yep. So the thinner the braid, definitely it's going to cut through the water a lot better.
Is there a recommended braid for slow pitch jigging?
So well, there's a few braids on the market from a tackle standpoint, what we're seeing now available. Sunline makes some great braids that are real thin. You'll see the PE braid. That'll be some, like they have some really thin offerings that you could get anywhere from like 12 pound all the way up to 60 pound that are much, much thinner than your standard diameter braids in equivalent line ratings. Spro came out with a specific braid for slow pitching. It's their slow pitch braid. So a Max Quattro from Shimano is another great offering that's local. It's thin, it's a little bit more coarse, but it's very thin. It'll definitely work for a lot of our techniques out here.
If you don't know what you're looking for, you want to just look for something that's the smallest diameter you can get away with. Generally a 4-carriage braid. For our products out here, it'd be like a 4-carriage braid, Max Quattro. But most of the 4-carriage braids, you really want to stay away from the real 8-carriage and 12-carriage because those have a tendency to have a lot more weaving in it. They're a lot looser, and then you catch a lot more resistance in the water. You get a lot of more billowing effect from the current and stuff like that. 4-carriage braids are usually a little bit tighter, a little bit smaller diameter. Yeah, it comes down to personal preference.
Yep.
You know, there's no right or wrong braid for it. It's personal preference.
Awesome. Anthony, did you have anything to add when it comes to slow pitch jigging techniques?
One of the things, I mean, Ceasar pretty much covered the techniques. That's really all you really need to know. If you do want to mix it up, one of the things I do a lot with rockfish is I like keeping my hooks on the top of the jig. That way I can knock it on the bottom. And what you'll see me doing for some of the times if they're being really lethargic or there's a lot more current and these fish are staying hugging to the bottom a little bit more, what I'll do is I'll lift the rod up maybe about a foot and I'll slam the rod tip down fast and let that jig stay right there on the bottom. Instead of bringing it up as much and then dropping back down, I'll really just hug along the bottom. And one of the things that you want to make sure that you're doing is don't drop the jig straight down and let it start scoping out. Because as you're eventually going to snag something and you're never going to get it back because your boat's drifting away. So what you'll see me doing is going to the back corner of the boat or up in the bow of the boat, and I'll be fishing on the wrong side of the boat. I don't do that midship because if something does happen, I don't want to end up tangling up and ruining somebody else's day. So you'll see me in the back corner. I'll be casting up swell, let it hit the bottom, and I'll vertical bounce that where I lift up and drop down fast and just wind the slack in. I'll go to lift up and you'll get those bites oftentimes on that slow lift up. And as the boat drifts towards it, you'll get that spot where it's straight up and down. That's usually when I reset. If you get greedy, a lot of times that's where you hook the bottom and you lose your jig. So if you can, when you get vertical, wind straight up. And you'll find, you know, your first cast, just make a nice easy cast up swell. And I usually don't do overhand. It's usually a nice little underhand pitch. Get it up current, and that way when it comes back down vertical, I get a couple bounces with it in that zone, and then I'm starting over.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and hopefully getting some people started. We make this video to be helpful to the fishing community. Come out to your local shop. Hopefully this video was helpful for you in getting started. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. Until the next one, tight lines.